Welcome to the Woman's Connection. I'm Barrie-Louise Switzen, your moderator. The Woman's Connection is a program about events shaping women's lives and helping one gain authentic power on a personal or professional level. So won't you stay tuned? Welcome. My guest in this segment is Margaret Benshoof-Holler, who wrote a book called The Burning of the Marriage Hat. And I would like to welcome Margaret. Margaret, welcome.
Thank you.
You wrote this interesting book about your life, and it's, what would you say, it's a semi-autobiography?
Well, it started out as a nonfiction book. I was going to write a nonfiction book. I had returned to Wyoming, the motto is the equality state, and I had gone back there to do some research on family. And in the process of writing the book, I had to flesh out my main character. And in fleshing her out, I ended up fleshing myself out.
So it was almost a therapeutic experience for you?
Yes, I would say so. That wasn't the purpose at the time. The purpose was just to get this character out, and it was difficult in the beginning. But then gradually she started coming out, and yeah, ended up being very therapeutic.
What's the book about?
The book is about a woman, Catherine, who returns to her roots in Wyoming. She's on a road trip, and she's headed to a town to find out what happened to her grandmother, who she understands burned to death in a fire.
Oh, my.
And there's a lot of denial in the family. It's the same type of denial that came out when she became a teenager and pregnant, but this was a denial that she felt she had to get to the root of, so she returned there, and in the process she's egged on by her grandmother's ghost, and she comes into contact with other ghosts in the family, including possibly her own.
Oh, interesting. Now, you as a teenager became pregnant, and you gave your daughter up for adoption. What was going on at this time, and that was in the 1960s?
Yes, this was the 1960s. It was before Roe versus Wade, so there were not many options, and also the attitudes at the time towards teen pregnancies was not very good. So if you became pregnant out of wedlock, it was hushed up. You disappeared out of your high school classroom one day. If you were in a large school, nobody knew what happened to you. If you were in a small school, people had an idea. You went away to a home and you hid until the whole thing was over, and you had a baby one day. The next day they had you sign papers, and then the next day you were home again, where this loss, this tremendous loss of a child, was never spoken of again. So there was a great deal of denial around this. Now, this was a time when, as I say, the abortion laws were very conservative. It was before Roe versus Wade, and it was also before, well, even still, the welfare programs were very weak. But during the 60s, a lot of those social programs were being developed along with civil rights, and therefore, people who were against civil rights instead, focused on the social programs. Before the 60s, women were not the schemers of welfare ever until these civil rights bills started coming. So really it's a pretty much of a racist type of thing that came out with the welfare programs.
Wow.
And the social programs during the 60s. So those two together, in a society like Sweden, where you have both a liberal welfare program and a liberal abortion, women do much better.
So in other words, at this point in time of your teenage, where you're just finding out about your body, it's going through all these changes, you become pregnant out of wedlock,
yes.
And you have basically no options of how to handle your life.
There were only the option: you could get married, or you could go away and hide and give the child up for adoption. And there was a big demand from infertile couples to adopt children then. So you had a role. Your purpose was to go to a home, and then you could give your child up for adoption, and there were people waiting for your child. And so it was a very rushed thing, and it was very much covered up.
Looking back, do you have any regrets giving up your daughter? Or did you have a daughter?
I had a daughter, yes, I had a daughter. Until I started I found her. I think before that, I don't know if they were regrets, but there were a lot of issues that weren't dealt with. You see, when there's denial and things are not being dealt with, you don't know exactly what's going on. You just know that there's something incomplete and you want to find your daughter. And so I can't say that it's a regret at this point, because I don't really like to regret things, but I don't think the society dealt with the whole thing very well, and because of, and it still doesn't, that the people in the adoption triad, especially the adoptees and the birth mothers, and then you have the adoptive parents too, which I'm not really sure what role they play, but these people who have been labeled, that they have to take on still a stigma and deal with this thing when it was a societal, and has been and is, a societal issue all along, of not dealing with loss, not dealing with sex, not talking about sex, not dealing with...
Very puritanical.
Yep. And unwed pregnancy. Pregnancy and sex, there's a stigma associated with both of those. And there's certain expectations that you have to enter pregnancy and marriage very lily white in a certain way, or there is still a tinge of sin to it and a stigma.
Well, do you think things are changing? Things are not changing, or have changed a little bit?
Well, they have changed for women in that Roe versus Wade. We have that. There is a liberal abortion system where women can choose, but that's always being tested. The thing, I see what's happening with the teen pregnancies and this welfare mothers is a stigma. It's, as I mentioned earlier, how this got started with welfare mothers was really a racist issue, and not, the welfare programs sure are taking money, but nothing like the money that's been put into the war effort. And so you know, there is no health care system in this country, along with the, you know, if a truly Christian culture looks after the widows and orphans. And this is a system that women are being encouraged to get married, and I don't see that as solving the problem.
So in other words, you really want to have to go back and address the issue and not the cure. I mean, the cure is one thing, but it can keep happening, so you have to go back and address it. Do you think that there's a chance of it being cured?
Now, what being cured? The cure of the welfare system, or the cure of what happens when you're unwed and pregnant?
I think unwed and pregnant.
I don't know that I would call it a cure. I think that there's a healing that needs to take place. I think when, you know, women can use their voices and feel confident about who they are and valued as human beings, then there is a healing in that, and being listened to. I think, though, when you see what happens when people lose somebody in death in this culture, or to adoption, or whatever, we don't deal well with loss in this culture, and a lot of the way we deal with loss is intermingled with what happens with the adoption system, and, you know, being pregnant out of wedlock. It's all tied together. The loss does not get fully, you're not like in a culture where you can rip your clothes and wail and cry, but we are supposed to stuff it in a good puritanical type of way.
Stiff up their lip.
Right. So, and then blame someone else for it.
Well, let me ask you this. All right, as a youngster, I don't know exactly how old you were when you went through this whole ordeal, but do you think it had to do with lack of education?
Yes, I do. We don't have a good coming-of-age process in this culture for either men or women, young girls and boys, and sex is a topic that people don't really like to talk about, and there's really no place to talk about sex, explore sex, find out about it, ask questions. Really having a, you know, good sex education place, a good place also for girls to gain confidence. They're still, like, just in the computer area of girls not feeling that they're competent, and it spills over into a lot of areas, and I see then as women age, and especially having lived outside of this culture and seeing how women were more confident in a certain type, so we had more self-esteem, I think, used their voice more in certain, especially the Mediterranean cultures. that coming back here and seeing the weakness of women afraid to really use their voice and having to apologize immediately after if they showed anger or raised their voice.
Do you have any regrets?
You know, I don't think so. I mean, I did before, but so much has happened in my life. You know, I think it all started changing when I found my daughter. I came back in touch with certain elements, and then deaths in the family brought me into touch with more elements of what loss was about. And then I wrote my book, and the book was another step. And, you know, I would not have done any of these things if it hadn't have been for that. At the same time, I don't think it was the best thing for me. I don't think it's the best thing for any girl, any person, to not have choices, to not be able to make their own choice. I was not able to make the choice. Everyone decided for me. So
it was an embarrassment.
It was an embarrassment. So regrets. Yes and no. You know, yes, I wish I could have held my daughter in my arms as a baby and cradled her and rocked her back and forth and really held her and let her see my love. And now, later, when you find a daughter that you've given up for adoption, it's a different level that you're coming in. You may feel still all of the motherly things, but you know, she has grown up with an adoptive mother who she did all of her bonding with. And so there are certain things that have to be worked through. So in that respect, yeah, if I had raised my daughter, but at the same time, I see that a lot of the issues that come up with my daughter after finding her are very similar to what happens with the teenage girl and the mother she's growing up with. There's testing and anger and all types of things. So some of it is similar, but there are other issues that you have to deal with, and you just deal with it. And I was given this, and I dealt with it.
How did you find your daughter?
I started searching for her, and I searched for a whole year and was getting ready to give up. And because I was trying to deal with the bureaucracies that had all of the records closed, and thought this is impossible. And then I got a phone call, and the person said, well, here, I have your daughter's name.
How did you feel at that moment?
Just like I felt when I said it just now. I felt this weeping thing inside of me, like, I want to cry. It was like, oh my God, this is my daughter. And so yes, it was just like, so many different types of emotions came up for me.
How did your daughter react when you approached her? Or
Well,
what steps did you take? Let's back up a minute. What steps did you take to approach your daughter?
Well, first of all, I found her name and her parents' names, and so I went right back up to Wyoming, that's where I grew up and where she was adopted, and went right to the driver's, just the records in the library and the city guides, and you know, went to the town where they lived. I got her high school yearbooks and saw her picture for the first time. And the funny thing is, this is the really funny thing, I went into the school system, the Department of Education, to ask them where I could go to get the high school yearbooks. And when I looked down at the plaque of the woman who I was asking, it was my daughter's adoptive mother's name. And I didn't tell her who I was then. We talked later, but you know, I was afraid that if, you know, of course, I didn't want to be sabotaged in finding my daughter. And
right.
So,
what was your daughter's reaction when you approached her? Or how did you approach her?
Well, I decided to, it took me about a month of, you know, trying to decide how to do this. So I finally found out where she was married and, you know, where she lived. And I found they didn't have a phone, or I couldn't find a phone, so I called another person with the same last name as the man she married, and I asked her if, I told her I was looking for my daughter's name, and I was wondering if she could get in touch with her. She said yes, it was her sister-in-law, and she would be glad to have her call me, and I told her I was doing some genealogy work, and I thought we might be related. So she called me later, was it later that night or the next night, and I had this whole thing written out, exactly what I was going to say to her. And as soon as she's on the phone, I just was hemming and hawing and bumbling around, and I couldn't get the words out.
So what happened?
Well, so finally I said, I've been doing some searching, and I had a daughter who was born on such and such a date in such and such a maternity home in Denver. And I've recently found out that her name is my daughter's, her name, and she said, oh, well, where did you grow up? And I said, I told her, she says, well, you know, that fits and all. But it was only later in the conversation when I told her if she wanted to find out more, she could go to the maternity home and they would give her the information, because they had a release thing that if I had signed to release the information. And I said, and you know, this is the name that I gave you when you were born, Kelly
Oh, my.
Sue. And she goes, so she
I
knew
got
the name.
goosebumps.
She knew the name, and that was what did it. She said, you know, my mother told me that's what. So this crying you hear in my voice right now, there was the crying, the catch of the voice as she heard that I had named her Kelly Sue, and it was the qualifier that, yes, I am your mother. So.
How did she react?
Oh yes, she wanted to see me. I wanted to see her right away, and she wanted to see me. I wanted to rush over there, and so I said, well, you know, I don't want to rush you or anything, but maybe I could come out over Labor Day, and that's what I did, and I met her.
How soon after?
It was a couple weeks.
Couple weeks after.
Yeah.
So it's a happy reunion?
Yeah, it was a good reunion.
And are you still in touch, or was it strained at any point?
Yes. We've. Well, I found her, and then I was offered a job overseas after that, which I took, and I thought that it would allow her and her adoptive parents plenty of space to get used to this. And then when I came back, we developed our relationship more, and it's had its up and downs.
Like any relationship?
Yeah, only, you know, sometimes, you know, there are things that are harder because there are maybe unresolved anger, especially, you know, in the adoptee, that people have different rates of dealing with things. And so the downs are always related to that, going kind of back to some kind of unresolved thing that I think for an adoptee it's really hard because they can't remember that separation as well, but it does affect them just as strongly and just as well as the birth mother. But the birth mother has more of an idea because she remembers every moment of it.
Sure.
So
wow. So going forward, what's in store with you and your daughter?
I don't know. I hope more healing. I hope. And she, you know, she has a husband and family, and she's.
Are you a grandmother?
Yeah, I'm a grandmother.
Oh, nice.
So we just see, you know, there are points where you get to where you let go and you go on with your own life, and that's necessary for anyone. No matter if you're with the daughter that you raised, or if you're with the daughter that you gave up for adoption, or a husband, or anyone, there's a certain point you can't hold on. You can't hold on to anything, and that can be an issue with the adoption triad. There does tend to be, there's a tendency for, I think, the adoptive parents to want to hold on to that child when a birth parent comes into the picture, and you know, there's no ownership in life. You have to let it go. But so in that respect, there is that I've noticed, and I've noticed it with other situations. There's that tendency, that insecurity, I think, when there's an adoption for the adoptive parents' side.
Well, they're afraid. They
Yes.
spent all this time and energy, and they're afraid of losing what they've built up, this trusting relationship.
Yes. Yes. And then, you know, each person has certain insecurities to deal with in this whole thing. So, but some of that can affect the relationship that develops because the adoptee is somewhat in the middle, being pulled in two directions. Sure. So that's what I see. And then the adoptive mother comes into the picture. And, well, I mean, and each person deals with this differently. You know,
well, going forward, what would you recommend for somebody? Let's say, I'm not saying you're recommending to have an abortion or not an abortion, or giving up a child or not giving up the child, but what would you recommend going forward on how to deal with some of these issues?
With adoption triad, or with...
Well, with the adoption, with making choices. I mean, we have more choices in the now.
I think women need to be given as many choices as possible. It should have nothing to do with somebody else deciding if they can make them or not. If you want an abortion, you get an abortion. There should be no shame or guilt associated with it. It's a religious thing. The same thing with adoption. If that's what you want to do. I think adoption is the very worst thing, though. Studies have been done that show that adoption is much harder on a woman than abortion. There are many more years of not knowing and what to go through, what happened to the child. Abortion, you know what happens, and it's a final decision. I think women should make their choice, have these choices, and it's. I don't think that the guilt and shame, but there's such an issue over it, and everybody has very strong feelings in this culture. And I didn't notice the same strong feelings in Sweden when I lived there, of course, because that's one of the more liberal countries for women. And it was educational for me being there too, actually, and living. Probably more educational than anything else that I've been through. But so moving forward, give a young girl, even a teenager, let her make the final decision. It should not be anybody's decision but her own. But it doesn't require talking through, yes, but let her make it.
But even a child who's having a child who gets pregnant at 13,
yes,
isn't that a little young for a person to make their own life
decisions?
It
is young. I'm not saying it shouldn't be talked through, but I feel like no matter what age, that's how you instill confidence in somebody to help them to become even more confident as they grow older. If you give them a place for dialogue and expression and talking through and respecting what a 13-year-old has to say, regardless of the maturity level. How mature are people anyway? I mean,
I know some idiots at 30, or 40.
So I just say respect what anyone has to say. Allow them the place to speak it, and let them have their say, and go with it with giving guidance if they're 13 years old, but don't force your decision on anyone.
We didn't talk about the male involved in this. Did he know? Was he involved in any of this?
When I was pregnant?
Yes.
Yes. The book that I wrote, Burning of the Marriage Hat, is related, symbolic in a lot of ways in relationship to this. It's symbolic in that in life one wears many hats, or it may wear many hats at different times. One of the hats you might wear is the marriage hat, and at the age of 17, the father and I were going to get married, but it was like a shotgun wedding. It felt that way. It felt forced. I wanted him to say, yes, I want to marry you. I didn't want to feel forced, and he backed out, and I wasn't going to push it. My parents wanted to push that, but I said, absolutely not. He's made his decision, and I'm leaving, and that was it, and that's what I'm doing. But he backed out, and that was very hard on me, very, very hard. And it took me a long time to get over that, and it took me a long time to have a normal relationship with a man. Again, if I ever have been able to have a really normal relationship with men, I don't even really know what a normal relationship with a man is. But I think some people might know. I think if you have a really open dialogue growing up, and you have a good relationship with both mother, father, sister, brother, whatever people, there is a sense of learning how to relate. But later, so he didn't marry me, and I burned the marriage hat. I didn't know I would do that. I didn't know I would never marry. And I thought because our culture puts such a high value on marriage, it was hard for me to get over the idea that maybe, I kept feeling pushed into marriage, and then this is what I should do. Maybe this is what I want to do at certain times with certain people. And it's not like I didn't have any opportunities, it just was never right. And then somewhere along the line, maybe it was in Sweden, in being overseas, I know it was, that I felt I'm free of this. I don't need the marriage. I don't need it anymore. And it sort of just gradually dawned on me that I like being a single woman. It's not that I don't value a man, a relationship with a man, but it all evolved because of the direction my life went with getting pregnant at 17.
Margaret, what was your relationship with your parents?
Well, my relationship with my parents in the 50s and 60s, well, let's just get to the 60s. Well, the 50s also, but there was a lot of, we have a nuclear family structure in this society, and a nuclear family structure is not the healthiest for anyone. And we still have a nuclear family system here, which means there are certain issues that don't get dealt with. So there are certain inner family problems that happen, and there is a lot of denial and a lot of there's a certain amount of scapegoating in this kind of system. I grew up with a mother and stepfather. My parents were divorced when I was very young, and I think during the period that we grew up in, when we had fathers who'd been in World War II and came back and they worked all the time, they had no time to spend with their daughters. So I didn't have time to spend with my stepfather, and then I didn't have time to spend with my father either because he was gone, divorced.
So that played a tremendous role in your life.
It played a tremendous role, the loss of father. It comes out in the book. My father getting in his pickup one day and driving away, and I waited for him to return, and he never came back again. And so all of these things, you're given a certain bag to carry in life, and these were some of the things that were in my bag. And so I guess you could say that it makes it more interesting.
Mm-hmm. What would you like to leave the audience with?
Well, I guess I would like to leave the audience with the idea that that a woman doesn't have to get married to be fulfilled in her life, and she doesn't have to have something to hold on to prove who she is as a human being.
Margaret, thank you so much for joining me.
Yes.
It's been wonderful listening to your life story, the first part, the first half, and I hope you've learned something about choices for you, and hope you make the right one, whatever it may be.